Spring, 1846, Independence, Missouri. To understand the scale of the tragedy, you must first understand the scale of the optimism. The Donner Party did not walk into the wilderness prepared for suffering. They walked into it prepared for a coronation. The centerpiece of this confidence was James Reed's wagon. It was a vehicle that became a legend on the trail before it ever became a tomb. Reed, the wealthy Irish aristocrat, didn't want his family to suffer the indignities of the road. He designed a wagon that defied the laws of physics and common sense. They called it the Pioneer Palace car. It was massive, 2 stories high. The wheels were oversized iron-shod timber. The entrance was on the side, like a train car, not the back. Inside, it was carpeted. It had a cast-iron stove for heating. It had cushioned seats that folded into beds. It had mirrors. Imagine that. Mirrors. In a world of dust and mud, the Reed family could look at themselves in glass. It required 8 oxen to pull it, double the normal team. As it rolled out of Independence, it wasn't just a wagon, it was a statement. It said, "We are conquering this continent on our own terms." George Donner, while less ostentatious, was equally laden. He had sewn $12,000 in gold into a quilt, a fortune in 1846. His wife, Tamsin, was a creature of intellect. She stood barely 5 feet tall, but she was a giant of will. She brought oil paints, school books, and apparatus for preserving botanical specimens. She wrote back to her sister in Illinois, "I am willing to go and have no doubt it will be the best for our children. We go, not because we are poor, but because we are young at heart." Young at heart. George was 62. They were chasing a fountain of youth. The wagon train was a rolling city. 87 people. There was Patrick Breen, an Irish Catholic with a wife and 7 children. He kept a diary that would become the black box of the disaster. There was Louis Kieseberg, a tall, blonde German immigrant. He was educated, spoke 4 languages, but had a temper that frightened people. He was an outsider, traveling with a beautiful young wife, Philippine. There were the Eddies, the Graves, the Murphys. They moved west in a cloud of dust and noise. For the first 2 months, it was a picnic. They averaged 15 miles a day. The children played tag among the sagebrush. They sang songs around the campfire. The biggest worry was a broken axle or a stray cow. They felt invincible. June 27th, 1846, Fort Laramie. The first shadow fell over the party. James Reed met an old friend, James Clyman. Clyman was a mountain man. He wore buckskins greased with animal fat. He had walked the continent. He had just come from California, riding east. He had seen the route Lansford Hastings was promoting, the shortcut south of the Great Salt Lake. Reed invited Clyman to the campfire. He poured him whiskey. He pulled out Hastings' book. "We plan to take this new route," Reed said. "It cuts 300 miles. We can avoid the difficult climb north." Clyman looked at Reed. He looked at the women and children in their fine clothes. He looked at the massive palace car. "Mr. Reed," Clyman said, his voice gravelly, "take the regular wagon track. Do not turn south. The shortcut is not a road. It is canyons and desert. It is death on the hoof." "But Hastings says it is level," Reed argued. "He says it is fine." "Hastings is a lawyer," Clyman spat. "I am a walker. I have walked it. You cannot take wagons that way." It was the classic confrontation, the theorist versus the practitioner. Reed was a man of books. He trusted the printed word of a fellow educated man, Hastings, over the grunts of a dirty trapper. Reed had summit fever. He wanted to get there first. He wanted the best land. He calculated the mileage in his head. 300 miles saved. That's 3 weeks. We'll be in California by September. When they reached the Little Sandy River, The train split. Most of the wagons listened to climbing. They turned right toward Fort Hall. They reached California safely before the first flake of snow fell. The Donner Reed party turned left, into the Hastings Cutoff. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't the terrain, it was the silence. Lansford Hastings, the author of the guide, was supposed to be waiting for them at Fort Bridger to guide them personally. When they arrived, he was gone. He had already left with another group, but Reed was stubborn. "We can follow his tracks," he said. They entered Echo Canyon. It was beautiful, red rocks, green grass. Then they hit the Weber Canyon. The road disappeared. The canyon walls narrowed until the river took up the entire floor. To move forward, they had to drive the wagons in the river, bouncing over boulders the size of beer barrels. Then they found the note. Stuck to a bush was a piece of paper from Hastings. "The road ahead is impassable. Do not follow me. Send a messenger ahead to find me." Reed rode ahead alone. He found Hastings miles away. Hastings looked at Reed from a high peak and pointed to a different route. "Go over the mountains," he said. "Don't follow the river." Reed rode back to the party. "We have to go over the Ruby Mountains," he told them. This is the part of the story that is often skipped, but it is where the disaster truly began. They had to turn untamed wilderness into a road. For 21 days, they became a construction crew. They had to chop down giant aspen trees. They had to move boulders with leverage and sweat. They had to double-team the oxen to drag the wagons up 40-degree slopes. The palace car became a curse. It was too wide for the trees. They had to cut a wider path just for Reed's vanity. The men's hands were blistered raw. The axes grew dull. Tempers flared. "Why are we doing this?" Kieseberg shouted. "We should turn back." But they couldn't turn back. They had come too far. They averaged 1 mile a day, 1 mile, while the other wagon trains on the main trail were doing 15. By the time they cleared the Wasatch Mountains and looked down at the Great Salt Lake, they were exhausted. Their oxen were thin. Their morale was shattered. And it was already August 20th. They stood at the edge of the Great Salt Lake Desert. Hastings had written, "A dry drive of 40 miles, 2 days." They prepared for 2 days. They cut grass. They filled every bucket with water. They started walking. The salt desert is a psychological torture chamber. The surface is a hard crust of white salt, but underneath, it is gray sludge. As the heavy wagons rolled, they broke through the crust. The wheels sank into the muck up to the hubs. It was like dragging the wagons through glue. Day 3. No water, no end in sight. The sun was relentless. The salt reflected the heat into the faces of the oxen. The animals began to moan, a low, terrifying sound of dying beasts. Then came the hallucinations. Tamsin Donner wrote about seeing lakes in the distance. Blue, shimmering water. The oxen saw it too. James Reed's oxen, the magnificent team that pulled the palace car, smelled the phantom water. They went crazy. They snapped their yokes. They ran off into the dark, chasing the mirage. Reed rode after them, but they vanished into the white void. Day 4. Children were crying for water. Fathers were giving them vinegar and sugar just to wet their mouths. People began to abandon their wagons. They unhitched the oxen and just walked, leaving their heirlooms, their furniture, their books sitting on the salt flats. Day 5. They finally saw the mountains on the other side, Pilot Peak. They crawled toward the springs at the base. When the oxen smelled the real water, they stampeded. They had crossed it, but the cost was catastrophic. It wasn't 40 miles. It was 80. It took 6 days. 36 head of cattle were dead or lost. 4 wagons were left behind forever in the salt. James Reed, the leader, the rich man, was humbled. He had lost his team. He had to bury his palace car's contents in the desert. His family had to share a wagon with others. The hierarchy of wealth was gone. The desert had equalized them. September, Nevada. They were alive, but they were depleted. They were now in a race against the calendar, but they had a new enemy, the Paiute Indians. The Paiutes of the Great Basin were poor and hungry. They saw these slow, stumbling white invaders with their fat cows. They didn't see people. They saw a buffet. They didn't attack openly. They waged a war of attrition. At night, they would sneak into the camp. They would shoot arrows into the oxen, not to kill them instantly, but to wound them so they couldn't walk. If an ox can't walk, the immigrants have to leave it behind. Then the Paiutes would butcher it. Night after night, the Donner Party would wake up to find another 2 or 3 oxen crippled. They were losing their engines, and they were losing their food supply. They tried to stand guard, but the Paiutes were ghosts. By early October, the party was dangerously short on animals. They had to yoke cows and heifers, animals meant for milk and breeding, to the wagons. The pace slowed to a crawl. The stress was unbearable. Every man looked at his neighbor with suspicion. "Why are you moving so slow? Why are you holding us up?" October 5th. Iron Point. This is the moment the group's soul broke. They were trying to get up a steep, sandy hill, double-teaming the wagons. John Snyder, a young, popular teamster driving for the Graves family, was struggling. His oxen were tangled. James Reed rode up. He was tense. He tried to offer advice. Snyder exploded. "You and your shortcuts. You killed our cattle." Snyder began to whip his oxen violently. He was beating them over the head with the heavy butt of his bullwhip. "Stop it," Reed shouted. "You'll kill the beasts." Snyder turned on Reed. "I'll whip you too, you rasping tyrant." He struck Reed. The heavy wood opened a gash on Reed's head. Blood blinded him. Tamsin Donner ran in to stop it. Snyder struck her too. Reed drew his hunting knife. It was instinct. He thrust upward. The blade entered Snyder's chest, just below the collarbone. Snyder gasped. "I am a dead man." He fell. He died in minutes. The camp erupted. Kaiserberg, the German, grabbed a wagon tongue. "Hang him," he screamed. "Hang the murderer." They propped up the wagon tongue to use as a gallows. But Reed had a gun, and he had his family. Tamsin threw herself between the mob and her husband. The cooler heads, Patrick Breen, William Eddy, stepped in. "We cannot have a hanging," Eddy said. "Not in front of the children." The verdict: banishment. James Reed was to be exiled. He had to leave the camp, without a wagon, without food, without his family. If he was seen again, he would be shot. It was a death sentence. To ride alone into the Sierras with winter coming? Impossible. But Reed accepted it. He kissed Tamsin. He kissed his daughter Patty. "I will go over the mountains," he swore. "I will get to California. I will bring back food. I will bring back help." He rode west into the sunset. The group watched him go. They had just exiled their most capable leader. Now George Donner was in charge. But George had injured his hand fixing a wagon axle. The wound was infected. He was feverish. The snake had no head. Late October. The Truckee Meadows, modern-day Reno. They rested. This is the most agonizing part of the history. They had made it across the desert. They were at the foot of the mountains. The sky was gray. The wind was cold, but the cattle were so tired. "Let's rest," they said. "Just for 3 days. Let the cattle graze. We need them strong for the pass." 3 days. If they had kept moving, they would have made it. Those 3 days cost them everything. On October 28th, a jagged, dark cloud appeared over the peaks. An old Native American guide looked at it. He wrapped his blanket tighter. "Winter," he said. Panic set in. "Yoke up! Move!" They drove the cattle hard. They entered the canyon leading to the lake. It started to rain, then sleet. Then, the heavy wet flakes of the Sierra cement. The vanguard of the party, the Breens, the Eddies, the Kieserbergs, reached the lake on October 31st. They looked up at the pass. It was a notch in the granite wall 1,000 feet above them. The trail was gone. It was covered in 5 feet of snow. They tried to push the oxen through. The animals floundered, their bellies dragging in the snow. They bellowed in panic. The wagons were useless. They abandoned the wagons. "We walk," they said. "We carry the children." They trudged up the slope. They got within 3 miles of the summit. 3 miles. They could see the gap, but the snow was too deep. It was soft powder. They sank to their waists. The children were crying. The darkness was falling. They decided to camp. "We will try again in the morning," they said. "The crust will freeze tonight. We can walk on top of it." They huddled under blankets. They slept on the snow. While they slept, the storm intensified. When they woke up on November 1st, they were buried. Another foot of snow had fallen. The pass was now blocked by 10 feet of drift. They turned back to the lake. They found a few abandoned cabins from a previous year. They huddled inside. "We will wait out the storm," they said. "It will melt in a few days." It snowed for 8 days. Then it snowed for another week. By mid-November, the snow at the lake was 15 feet deep. The cabins were buried. The livestock had wandered off and died in the drifts. The door was shut. The key was thrown away. 81 people, trapped in the white tomb, and the hunger began to wake up. November 1846. The trap was not a single location. It was split in 2. Most of the group, the Breens, the Murphys, the Graves, and the Kessebergs, along with the Reed family, minus James, were at Truckee Lake. They had taken shelter in 3 crudely built log cabins left by previous immigrants. These cabins were miserable. No windows, dirt floors, green wood roofs that leaked freezing water constantly. Into these dark, smoky boxes, 59 people were packed. But 6 miles back, at a place called Alder Creek, the Donner families, George and Jacob, were in a worse situation. A broken axle had stopped them just short of the lake. When the storm hit, they didn't have time to build cabins. They had to build tents. They cut saplings and threw canvas and quilts over them. 21 people, including a dozen children, were living in tents buried under the snow. They had no walls, just cloth separating them from the sub-zero wind. The snow kept falling. It didn't drift, it accumulated. 5 feet, then 10, then 15. The world turned monochrome. There was no horizon, just white snow and gray sky. The trees were buried up to their branches. To get from one cabin to another, they had to dig tunnels. They lived like moles. Dark, damp, freezing moles. By early December, the cattle were gone. Some had been slaughtered and frozen in the snow, but many had simply wandered off and died, buried deep in the drifts where they couldn't be found. The food supply was a math problem that resulted in 0. They began to eat the things that were not food. First, they boiled the ox hides. The hides had been used to roof the cabins. They stripped them off, scraped away the hair, and boiled them for hours until they turned into a foul, gelatinous glue. It had no nutrition. It just filled the stomach and tricked the brain for an hour. Then, they ate the bones. They boiled them until they were soft, then crunched them like chalk. Then, the mice. The tiny field mice that invaded the cabins were caught and eaten raw. Patrick Breen, the devout Catholic, began to keep a diary. December 17th. Snowing. Wind southeast. Bayless Williams died last night. Bayless Williams was the first to die of starvation. He worked for the Reed family. They dug a hole in the snow floor of the cabin and buried him. But the ground was frozen. They couldn't dig deep. The survivors looked at the body. They were hungry. But the taboo held. Not yet. They were still civilized. December 15th. It became clear that no one was coming. James Reed had not returned. The snow was 20 feet deep. They were going to die in these cabins. A man named Franklin Graves had an idea. He remembered his childhood in Vermont. He remembered snowshoes. He took the ox bows, the curved pieces of wood used to yoke the oxen, and sawed them into frames. He used strips of rawhide for the webbing. They were crude, heavy, and awkward, but they worked. You could walk on top of the snow. A group volunteered. They called themselves the Snowshoe Party. History calls them the Forlorn Hope. 15 people, 10 men, 5 women. Among them was William Eddy, the strongest man in the camp. He left his wife and 2 children behind, promising to bring back food. There were 2 Native American guides, Luis and Salvador, who had joined them earlier in the trip. There was Charles Stanton, a bachelor who had no family in the party but refused to leave the children. And there were fathers. Franklin Graves, nearly 60, went to save his daughters. They took the best of the remaining meat, what little there was. They took a blanket each. On December 16th, they walked away from the cabins. They climbed the pass. The snowshoes crunched on the crust. Those left behind watched them disappear over the white rim of the world. 15 ghosts walking into the blizzard. The Forlorn Hope crossed the summit. They thought the hard part was over. They were wrong. On the other side of the pass, the terrain was a nightmare of canyons and cliffs. And then the sun vanished. On Christmas Eve, the storm of the century hit. It was a blizzard so fierce it would have killed well-equipped mountaineers. The Forlorn Hope had no tents. They had wet wool clothes. They had eaten their last scrap of meat 2 days ago. They huddled together on an exposed ridge. They couldn't light a fire. The wood was too wet. They made a human pile. They lay under their blankets, shivering violently, waiting to freeze. Antonio, a Mexican teamster, died first. Franklin Graves, the man who made the snowshoes, died in the arms of his daughters, Mary and Sarah. "Save yourselves," he told them. "Eat my body if you must." Patrick Dolan went mad. Hypothermia broke his mind. He stripped off his clothes, screaming that he was hot. He ran into the snow and died. But the most heartbreaking death was Charles Stanton. Stanton had gone snowblind. He couldn't see. Every morning he had to be led by the others. He was slowing them down. On the morning of December 21st, he sat by the campfire smoking his pipe. Mary Graves asked him if he was coming. Stanton looked at her with unseeing eyes. "Yes," he said calmly, "I am coming soon." He never stood up. He sat there and let the snow cover him. He sacrificed himself so the others could move faster. December 26th, the camp of death. The storm broke. The sun came out. 10 people were left alive. They had not eaten for 6 days. They were surrounded by the frozen bodies of their friends and fathers. William Eddy looked at the survivors. They were skeletons. Luis and Salvador, the Native Americans, sat apart. They knew what the white men were thinking. They saw the hunger in their eyes. Someone spoke the words, "We must eat." It wasn't a savage frenzy. It was a weeping, praying, horrific necessity. They took a knife. They cut the flesh from the arms and legs of Patrick Dolan. They roasted it over the fire. They turned their backs so they wouldn't see each other eat. They tried not to think of his name. But then they had to eat Franklin Graves. His daughters, Mary and Sarah, sat there. They couldn't eat their father. They made a pact. No one would eat their own kin. The strangers ate graves. The daughters ate Dolan. They dried the rest of the meat. They labeled the packages so they wouldn't make a mistake. Fueled by the dead, they stood up. They put on their snowshoes. They kept walking. January 1847. The energy from the meat ran out. They were starving again. There were no more bodies. William Eddy looked at Luis and Salvador. The two Native Americans were exhausted. They hadn't eaten the human flesh. They refused. They were surviving on pine nuts and willpower. But now, William Foster, a man driven insane by hunger, looked at them differently. "They are dying anyway," Foster whispered. "We should kill them." Eddy was horrified. He told Luis and Salvador, "Run, he is going to kill you." The two men fled into the woods. A few days later, the group found them. Luis and Salvador had collapsed in the snow. They were alive, but unable to move. William Foster took his gun. He shot Luis in the head. He shot Salvador in the head. This was not survival cannibalism. This was murder for food. They ate the guides. While the Forlorn Hope was descending into barbarism, the families back at the lake were trying to hold on to civilization. Christmas Day, 1846. The Reed cabin. Margaret Reed, James's wife, had a secret. Back in November, she had hidden a small supply of food. A few cupfuls of flour, a strip of dried ox tripe, a few beans. She had saved it for this day. She called her 4 children. "Merry Christmas," she said. She boiled the tripe. She made a tiny dumpling out of the flour. It was a feast of tears. The children ate the morsels slowly. They talked about their father. "Do you think Papa is coming?" Across the camp, in the Breen cabin, Patrick Breen read the Bible aloud by the light of a burning pine stick. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want." Around him, his 7 children lay under hides, chewing on strips of leather. They believed God would save them. But in the Kieseberg cabin, things were darker. Louis Kieseberg watched his infant son die. He buried the baby in the snowbank outside the door. He went back inside. He looked at his wife. He looked at the other families. Something in Kieseberg broke that day. He stopped being a man and started being a survivor. January 17th, 1847. 33 days after leaving the lake. The Forlorn Hope was down to 7 people. William Eddy, William Foster, the 5 women. They stumbled out of the tree line. They saw a village. Acorn granaries, smoke. A Miwok village. The villagers saw them coming. They had never seen anything like this. 7 creatures, black with frostbite, smelling of death, stumbling and weeping. The Miwok women began to cry. They ran to them. They didn't speak English. They didn't need to. They carried the survivors into their huts. They gave them acorn mush. They massaged their frozen feet. William Eddy, the strongest man, had lost half his body weight. He grabbed the hand of a villager. "The others," he rasped, "the mountains." The Forlorn Hope had made it, but they had left a trail of blood across the Sierras, and the news they brought to the settlements in California sent a shockwave through the territory. "They are starving," Eddy said. "They are eating the dead." The disaster is no longer a secret. The race to save the remaining souls at the lake is about to begin, but for many, it is already too late. February 1847, California. While the Forlorn Hope was stumbling out of the mountains, James Reed, the man banished for murder, the man who promised to return, was raising an army. He had tried to cross the mountains in November, but was turned back by the snow. He had spent the winter in San Jose, frantic, fighting in the Mexican-American War just to secure support from the military. When William Eddy staggered out of the wilderness with news of the starvation, the alarm was finally raised. 7 men volunteered. They were not soldiers. They were not mountaineers. They were farmers, sailors, and immigrants. They carried 75 pounds of dried beef and flour on their backs. They climbed straight up the face of the snowpack. They slept on the ice. They didn't know if anyone was still alive. They were marching into a graveyard. On February 18th, they crested the pass. They looked down at Truckee Lake. It was a flat white sheet. The cabins were gone, buried completely under the drifts. There was no smoke, no sound, no movement. "They are all dead," one of the rescuers whispered. They shouted, "Hello, humans!" Suddenly, a hole appeared in the snow. A woman, emaciated and blackened by soot, climbed out of a tunnel like a gopher. It was a scene from Dante's Inferno. She looked at the men. She blinked in the blinding sun. "Are you men from California?" she asked. "Or do you come from heaven?" The first relief could not take everyone. They had almost no food left. They could only take 24 people. They had to make the most horrific calculation in history. Who stays? Who goes? They chose the children first, the ones strong enough to walk but weak enough to need help. Margaret Reed had to choose. She had 4 children. The rescuers said they could take her and 2 children. The other 2, Patty and Tommy, were too small. They would have to stay behind in the darkness for the next relief party. Imagine the mother, looking at her 8-year-old daughter. "You must stay here, Patty," Margaret said. "We will come back for you." Patty Reed, a little girl with a soul of iron, looked at her mother. "Well, mother," she said, "if you never see me again, do the best you can." The first relief marched away with 23 refugees. They left 31 people behind in the cabins. They left the Donner families at Alder Creek untouched. They were too far away, and the rescuers were too weak to reach them. They left them with no food. As the column of refugees walked away, little Patty Reed stood on the roof of the buried cabin and watched her mother disappear into the trees. The journey out was a nightmare. One of the children, Ada Kieseberg, died on the trail. Her mother, Philippine, had to leave her body in the snow. Then they met the second relief. James Reed was leading the second relief. On the trail, deep in the mountains, he met the first relief coming down. He saw his wife. He saw 2 of his children. He collapsed in the snow, weeping. But then he asked, "Where are Patty and Tommy?" "They are back at the cabins," his wife told him. "They are alive." Reed left his wife and pushed on. He had to save his children. When Reed arrived at the lake, he found Patty and Tommy. They were alive. Patty was sitting in the dark cabin, holding a tiny wooden doll she had hidden in her dress. Reed grabbed his children. He grabbed the Breen family. He gathered 17 people. He started the march back out. But the mountain wasn't done with them. A massive blizzard hit. For 2 days, the second relief and the refugees were pinned down in a hollow. They couldn't move. The fire sank into the snow pit. This became known as the starved camp. The rescuers, terrified of dying, abandoned the refugees. James Reed had to be dragged away by his men. He wanted to stay with his children, but his hands were frozen and he was going blind. "We have to go, Reed," they said. "If we stay, we all die. We will send help." They left the Breen family and the children in the pit. For 5 days, the Breens and the children sat in that hole. Isaac Donner died. Mary Donner burned her foot in the fire because she was too numb to feel the heat. Elizabeth Graves died. Her 5-year-old son sat on her corpse crying for milk. To survive, the children ate the bodies of the dead. When the third relief finally arrived days later, they looked into the pit. They saw Patrick Breen sitting by the fire. "You're alive?" the rescuer asked. "The Lord has sustained us," Breen said. While the lake cabins were being evacuated, the horror at Alder Creek, where the Donner families were, was absolute. George Donner was dying. His arm was gangrenous. The infection had spread to his shoulder. The third relief arrived in March. They found the tents. Jacob Donner was dead. His children were eating him. George Donner was bedridden. Tamsin Donner, George's wife, was still strong enough to travel. The rescuers told her, "Come with us, you can make it." She looked at her 3 daughters. She looked at her dying husband. She made the choice that defines the tragedy. She dressed her 3 little girls, Frances, Georgia, and Eliza, in their warmest clothes. She handed them to the rescuers. "Save my children," she said. Then she turned back to the tent. She refused to leave George to die alone. She sat down beside him. She held his rotting hand. She waved goodbye to her children as they were carried away. She knew she was choosing death. It was the ultimate act of loyalty. April 1847, the fourth relief. The winter was ending. The snow was melting. A final group of men went up to the lake. Their job was salvage. They wanted to recover the Donner money and see if anyone was left alive. They expected to find only bodies. They reached the lake cabins. Silence. Then, they saw a man, Louis Kayserberg. He was the only one left. He was sitting in a cabin surrounded by half-eaten bodies. There was a pot on the fire. It contained human liver and lungs. The rescuers were horrified. Kayserberg looked like a ghoul. He was wild-eyed, with long hair and a beard matted with blood. They asked him where Tamsin Donner was. Kayserberg told them she had arrived at his cabin late one night. She said George had finally died. She was delirious. She fell asleep. He claimed she died in the night. He admitted he ate her body. He said, "She was the best flesh I ever tasted. She had 4 pounds of fat on her." The rescuers searched the cabin. They found George Donner's gold in Kayserberg's pocket. They put a rope around Kayserberg's neck. "You murdered her," they screamed. "You killed her for the money and the meat." Kayserberg begged. "No, she told me to take the money for her children. I ate her to live. I did not kill her." They didn't hang him. They dragged him down the mountain. He was the last survivor. He was the man who had closed the book on the tragedy. Louis Kayserberg survived, but his life was over. The newspapers painted him as a monster, a vampire. They called him Kayserberg the Cannibal. People believed he had murdered Tamsin Donner. He opened a restaurant in Sacramento. No one would eat there. He ran a hotel. People burned it down. He lived in misery and poverty. Years later, he sought out Eliza Donner, Tamsin's daughter. He fell to his knees in front of her. He swore on a Bible, "I did not kill your mother," he wept. "I was insane with hunger, but I did not murder her." Eliza believed him. She forgave him. But history never really did. He died alone, a pariah, haunted by the taste of the woman who had saved the others. What happened to the others? Patty Reed, the little girl with the doll, survived. She grew up in California. She kept that tiny wooden doll for the rest of her life. It is in the Sutter's Fort Museum today, a symbol of the hope that couldn't be frozen. The Breen family, all 9 of them, survived. Not a single Breen died. They were the only family to come through intact. Patrick Breen's diary is the most important document of the tragedy. They became prominent landowners in San Juan Bautista. Mary Graves, the girl from the Forlorn Hope who watched her father die, married young. But she wrote that she often wished she had died in the snow because the memories of the meat never left her. Virginia Reed, James's daughter, wrote a letter to her cousin back east. It contains the most famous line of the entire ordeal, a warning to anyone who would follow. Never take no cutoffs and hurry along as fast as you can. Why are we obsessed with the Donner Party? Is it the gore? The cannibalism? No. It is because it shatters the myth of the American West. We like to believe that the pioneers were superheroes, that they conquered the land with grit and rifles. But the Donner Party proves that nature is not a backdrop for our glory. Nature is indifferent. It proves that civilized people, doctors, farmers, teachers, are only 9 meals away from savagery. When you drive over the Donner Pass today on Interstate 80, you do it in 10 minutes. You listen to the radio. You have the heater on. You're driving over the bones of George Donner. You're driving over the spot where Franklin Graves made snowshoes out of oxbows. You're driving over the starved camp where children waited in a hole for their father. The tragedy is not that they died. The tragedy is that they were us. They wanted a better life for their children. They wanted a shortcut to paradise, and they paid the toll that the mountain demanded. In the end, the snow melted. The grass grew back. The flowers bloomed around the lake. But if you listen closely to the wind in the Sierra Pines, you can still hear the echo of the question that haunts every survival story. What would you do to stay alive?